In an emergency, there's no time to lose.
Unit 32, victim is a 3-year-old male choking on an object.
Roger that. 32 dispatched. Timeout 10:33 a.m.
But what would you do if there was no one to help? No paramedics or EMTs to perform life-saving techniques. No ambulance to provide immediate transportation to an emergency facility. No help. You're on your own, and he's counting on you. Unfortunately, there are no paramedics or ambulances to respond when your dog is in crises. And emergencies can happen anywhere, anytime. Knowing what to do should the occasion arise can save your dog's life. By the end of this tape, you will have learned several procedures you can use to save your dog's life and stabilize his condition in an emergency. The techniques are easy to use and, for the most part, simple to perform. The results couldn't be more rewarding.
If you're like me, you find your dog's playfulness and curiosity a big part of what makes him so lovable. But those same qualities can also lead him into trouble in a world full of dangers which are often beyond his comprehension. Of course, prevention is the best medicine there is, and supervision is the best prevention when it comes to your dog's well-being. But no matter how diligent you are, accidents can happen. In many ways, your dog's anatomy is much like your own. His respiratory, cardiac, and central nervous systems function just like yours do, and his skeleton is more similar to yours than you might think. For this reason, many of the life-saving first aid techniques used in humans work just as well on dogs. But there are major differences between human and dog anatomy, and these differences necessitate specialized applications of the emergency medical technique. It is these specialized applications that we're going to learn today. These techniques should allow you to competently and efficiently handle almost any emergency which may arise. If veterinary help is not nearby, they are the best chance your dog has to survive and go on to lead a happy and healthy life. Have any family member who may be responsible for your dog watch this tape with you. And whenever possible, have your dog nearby. There are techniques we're going to learn that you'll want to practice on him.
Many accidents occur when you and your dog are away from home. Unfamiliar territory contains unfamiliar dangers. It's in those situations that a cool head and an understanding of emergency procedures is most valuable.
Good dog.
One such accident could occur just this easily.
Sheila, no!
It can happen that quickly. Miles from home, from help, alone. Your dog is hurt. What do you do? Let's watch Peter show us the right steps to take. Knowing that even your own dog can be dangerous when hurt, Peter approaches carefully. He knows he can't help Sheila if he himself becomes injured. Even though Sheila seems calm and accepting of Peter's approach, Peter will still take the precaution of making a muzzle before examining her. Though she's okay now, should the exam become painful, Sheila could lash out. Peter will use a portion of Sheila's leash to fashion a muzzle. You can use any long, flexible cloth that's available, from a strip of towel or t-shirt to a length of rope, a necktie, or even a pair of nylons. If you have a first aid kit nearby, a flexible ace bandage works very well. Use something that won't abrade the dog's muzzle or cause her further discomfort. First, Peter makes a closed loop with a half knot and slips it over Sheila's nose. He pulls it secure, but not too tight, leaving just enough room for the dog's jaw to part slightly, but not so much that she can slip out of it. Next, Peter makes another closed loop with a half knot under the jaw. Then he completes the muzzle by tying a tight bow behind Sheila's ears. A few pats and some quiet reassurance helps ease Sheila's concern. Now, Peter will begin his examination of Sheila. He gently probes Sheila's body, feeling for swelling, tenderness, or a limb which is loose, dangling, or misshapen. He looks for blood, misaligned angles, and pays attention to the dog's behavior. Is it in pain? Is it collapsed or unable to hold weight on its hind legs? These are all symptoms of fractures.
It's most common for dogs to fracture their legs, pelvis, lower jaw, or spine. Fractures range in severity from a hairline, which is a crack in the bone that doesn't penetrate through the full thickness, to a simple fracture in which the bone is broken through with one clean break. Severity then progresses to a multiple fracture in which the bone is broken into more than one piece. The worst kind of fracture is an open or compound fracture, in which a piece of bone penetrates through the skin.
Diagnosis of the type of fracture Sheila has will be up to Peter's vet. Peter's job is to protect Sheila from further injury by providing emergency treatment and safe transport. If transported improperly, a dog can sustain serious complications from a fractured bone. Depending on the severity of the break, these complications can range from infection to crippling to internal injury or even death. Peter has ascertained that Sheila most probably has broken her lower right front leg. Her limb causes Sheila pain and cannot bear weight. Peter will need to splint the leg to stabilize it for transport. What he wants to do is immobilize the leg, creating a means for holding it steady and straight. Any rigid, straight object will serve in an emergency. A piece of wood or stick, a rolled up newspaper, a tent stake. Peter uses a folded magazine. Now he needs something to secure it with, an article of clothing, a piece of rope, an elastic bandage. Peter decides to use the remaining portion of Sheila's leash. He places the injured leg into the pocket of the folded magazine and gently ties it on. The idea is to secure the leg, but not too tightly, just tightly enough that it won't slip around or move during transport. Now, Peter has to get Sheila to the car. Since he's alone, he'll have to carry Sheila. The best way for him to do this is to work his arms under Sheila and carry her, with one arm around her chest and the other in front of her back legs. If you have to carry your dog any distance and he's too heavy for you, you can use a fireman's carry. Lift the dog onto your back so that his front legs hang over one shoulder and his back legs over the other. Hold his legs, though not an injured one, for support. If possible, your best transportation method is to make a stretcher. You can use a blanket, a board, a large towel, even a coat or jacket for this procedure. But you need two people. Lay the coat next to your dog on the ground. Place your hands underneath the dog's body and lift him onto the stretcher. You may want to grab the scruff of his neck to gain control. If need be, you can lay the stretcher behind him and carefully roll him over onto it. With one person holding the corners at each end, you can lift the dog and carry him to safety.
Peter did a great job in assessing and treating Sheila's condition. But fractures of other bones aren't as easy to assess in the field, and they're potentially more dangerous. Fortunately, they're also more rare. Kelly and Cody here will help me show you a few points. If your dog is unable to use his hind legs, and there's no reaction when you pinch his toes, he may be suffering from a middle or lower spinal fracture. If he's unable to use any of his legs, he may be suffering from a neck fracture. Spinal fractures need to be handled very carefully to avoid causing further injury. Very slowly and very gingerly slide the dog onto a stretcher, supporting his weight fully from underneath. This is one case where you should not improvise. If you're alone and don't have what you need to help the dog handy, go get help, unless other injuries leave you fairly certain that delay will mean death. If your dog is unable to walk on his hind legs, but does have a reaction when you pinch his toes, or he walks very tentatively, favoring his hind legs, that may mean he has a pelvic fracture. Now, there's no splint you can make for a pelvic fracture, so you're best to carry him just like you would for a broken limb. Or better yet, use a stretcher and bring him to your veterinarian. Now, if he has a lower jaw fracture, if his teeth are out of alignment, he's bleeding from his mouth, or there's a gross deformity there, it won't require immobilization. The dog should be able to walk on his own and should be brought directly for veterinary care. 2 quick notes. If your dog is acting oddly after trauma, transport him with his head elevated. Also, only splint distal limb fractures, those from the elbow or knee down. Trying to splint a higher up fracture may actually displace it more. Well, that's a lot of information, and it might seem a bit overwhelming, but it's really pretty simple and follows general rules of common sense. Let's review before we move on to talk about profuse bleeding.
Always approach an injured conscious dog carefully. Fashion a muzzle by tying a long cloth or rope twice around her nose and fasten it behind her ears. Examine her for signs of fracture, including swelling, pain, holding a limb off the ground, dangling or misshapen limb, collapsed hind legs, or inability to move hind legs or all 4 legs. For a leg fracture, splint the leg by securing it to a rigid article. Carry the dog or place her on a stretcher and transport her for veterinary care. For a spinal fracture, grab the dog carefully by the scruff of the neck and pull her gently onto a stretcher and transport. For a fracture of the pelvis, carry the dog or place her on a stretcher and transport her. For a fracture of the lower jaw, lead the dog into a car and take her to the vets.
Diagnosing bleeding is obviously quite easy. There's no mistaking those signs. Fortunately, learning the correct treatment is almost as simple. But the first thing you should do should your dog be bleeding is to remain calm. That's often the hardest part, as it can look scary. But panic will only make the situation worse. You won't be able to think clearly, and you'll lose precious time. So, should the occasion arise, take a deep breath and remain focused. This is Baby Girl. She and Kelly are going to help us demonstrate some techniques. The treatment for bleeding is pretty much the same in all cases. First, form a muzzle like we learned in the section on broken limbs. Bleeding dogs can hurt, and hurt dogs can lash out. Next, apply firm, steady pressure using a gauze pad when available, or anything else that's handy in an emergency. Cleanliness of the dressing is important, though, to help prevent infection. Throughout this section, you'll hear me use 2 terms, dressing and bandage. A dressing is applied directly over the wound. The bandage is used to hold the dressing in place and sometimes apply pressure. For a small cut that's only oozing slowly, apply the clean dressing to the wound and press with your fingers for about 10 seconds. It's okay if your dog appears fidgety. This may mean that she's not too hurt. But it can also make the treatment more difficult, so it helps to have 2 people, one to hold the dog while the other performs the treatment. After 10 seconds, remove the dressing and reevaluate the wound. If it's still bleeding, reapply the dressing for a longer period of time, say about 20 seconds. Continue this until the bleeding stops. In all cases, do not dab, wipe, or clean the wound until after the bleeding has stopped. These actions may make matters worse if performed prematurely. If blood is flowing freely from a wound, apply a pad using heavy direct pressure, like I'm doing on Patches here. Secure the dressing in place using a wide adhesive tape if available, or any other substitute you can fabricate. I remember one dog was brought to me with a shirt sleeve tied around him holding the dressing in place. It's hard to say who looked funnier, the dog or his one-sleeved owner, but it sure worked. Use your own judgment in deciding whether the wound is severe enough to require veterinary attention, but leave the bandage in place for about 30 minutes before removing it to reevaluate the wound. If it's still bleeding at that point, reapply the bandage, and I'd recommend bringing him to a veterinarian. If bright red blood is spurting from a wound in a pulsating action, this indicates arterial bleeding, and your dog may be in grave jeopardy. Act quickly but calmly. Apply strong pressure to the wound with a dressing and hold it in place for about 30 seconds. Wrap a bandage over top of the pad and leave the bandage in place. Keep your dog immobilized, preferably wrapped in a blanket or towel, and bring him to your veterinarian or emergency care facility immediately. Do not remove the bandage, even to reevaluate the wound. If you see blood seeping or oozing through the bandage, apply another, more tightly wrapped bandage over top of the old one. Continue adding the bandages until the oozing stops. One caution: if you apply a pressure bandage to your dog for more than 20 minutes, check the limb below the bandage to make sure it's not swollen, cold, and still reacts to pain if pinched. A bandage applied too tightly can cut off all circulation and cause tissue damage. If this appears to be the case, rewrap the bandage, leaving the dressing in place a little more loosely. If your dog is bleeding from an inaccessible area, such as the inside of her nose, immobilize the dog and apply an ice pack, then seek veterinary help. To quickly review, and you may want to practice on your own dog now.
For minor bleeding, apply a dressing to the wound and hold it in place for about 10 seconds. Repeat as needed. For a wound where blood is flowing freely, apply heavy pressure to the site with the dressing for about 30 seconds. Then secure the dressing with a bandage. Reevaluate after 30 minutes and reapply as needed. For a wound which is spurting arterial blood, apply strong pressure to the site for about 30 seconds. Secure the dressing with a bandage and transport your dog for emergency treatment. Apply additional bandage as needed. Do not dab, wipe, or clean a bleeding wound. Check the limbs to make sure circulation is not cut off by a too tight bandage. For an inaccessible wound, apply an ice pack and keep the dog still.
Well, we've covered a lot of information. You may be feeling overwhelmed right now. It's probably a good idea to watch the tape at least one more time just to make sure the lessons stick. The techniques really aren't that difficult, and a lot of it is common sense. But having a solid grounding and knowing what to do can make all the difference in your ability to stay calm and focused should an emergency arise. A lot has been written about the roles dogs play in our lives, but you don't need me or anyone else to tell you how important your dog is to you. I hope that you never need to use any of the techniques we've learned, but if you do, I'm glad to have had this chance to help you help him.
The K911 emergency first aid video, from which the introductory course was taken, was created to help owners be prepared in the event of a crisis involving their dog. Without paramedics, emergency medical technicians, or ambulances to respond in the event of an emergency, and with the vet's office usually too far away or closed, you are your dog's only hope. Accidents can happen anywhere, anytime. Would you know what to do to save your best friend's life? In addition to the procedures you learned on this introductory tape, the acclaimed K911 video will teach you what to do in the event of poisoning, respiratory arrest, choking, cardiac arrest, and heat stroke. The K911 video is the only emergency first aid tape for dogs that is endorsed by the ASPCA, carried in the library of the American Veterinary Medical Association, and labeled essential by Booklist. This is the same tape used by many military, police, and search and rescue units for their training in canine emergency first aid. Learn what to do to save your dog's life in an emergency before it's too late. Call 1-800-596-5552 to order your copy of the K911 emergency first aid video. The K911 video sells for only $19.95. That's less than the cost of a bag of dog food and makes a great gift for all the dog lovers on your list. Call 1-800-596-5552 today and you'll receive this 12-page pocket reference guide free with each tape ordered. All major credit cards are accepted, or use your check by phone. For more information, visit us on the World Wide Web at k-911.com. To order, call 1-800-596-5552, only $19.95 plus shipping and handling and all applicable state taxes.